not pros at this?
I wasn't sure since it was a different style, so that's all.
So, Professor Tootle, we've done 20 or 30 shows now. From the most controversial of issues, abortion, gay rights, Second Amendment, the founding of our country, insurrection. And we can go on and on. We've taken current topics of the day and tried to take a historical view on those subjects. I'm hoping today is going to be a kind of an aha moment of, oh, I know what Professor Tootle and John Brackney are talking about. They're talking about America and its virtues and some of our failings, but its virtues, how a rule of law society should project itself internally and externally. That's my intent today, with the setting of, does history even matter? I mean, apparently, I submit that if we look at current events and how people blog on Facebook or tweet out in the World Wide Web, they don't care about history. They just want to express their feelings and they want to rant. And facts don't necessarily matter unless it's fact backing up their own opinion. But it may not be. It may just be a partial fact. It may not be the complete set of facts in context. I'm suggesting that most people don't care about our conversations, and I want you to prove us wrong. I want you to say, no, here's the reason that even if people don't currently think they care about history, here's why they do need to care about history. That's my premise of this show. And we're going to do that in 28 minutes plus 15 minutes Q&A. But do you want me to start with the Declaration of Independence, or would you like to give a reprise to my premise?
Well, I guess you could either ask a more focused question of me, or tell you what my response would be.
Yeah, great. So facts, opinion, or rant. Ready?
Okay.
You and I talk a lot about, we hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal. They are endowed by their creator with certain unalienable rights. Among these are life, liberty, and pursuit of happiness. I love that stuff. And the Constitution in relationship to it. I just love this. But we haven't talked a lot about that to serve these rights, governments are instituted among men, deriving their power from the consent of the governed. But we don't talk about the first sentence. We talk about the second sentence of the Declaration of Independence. When in the course of human events, a decent respect to the opinions of mankind require that they should declare the causes which impel them to separation. Professor, we can't even agree of January 6th, whether that was just some weirdos kind of like milling around the Capitol and some of them broke in, 600 or so, whether that was an insurrection, or whether that was a bunch of weirdos, or no, it was caused by the President of the United States. And admittedly, we don't know yet. We haven't studied it enough. When does history start to take place? And how should we view facts versus opinion versus rants? Where do you come in as a profession? Are you irrelevant or are you essential?
Well, I would hope I'm relevant.
Right. Well, talk to us.
So many things are all rattling through my brain. So the first thing that I think of is why I should be relevant. And I'm reminded of something that Calvin Coolidge wrote in this essay. Well, it was in a speech, and it's pretty ironic that it's in the speech where he says the words, "The business of America is business," and that is then taken out of context in order to imply that he thinks that business should be the all-powerful driving force in America. Because what that speech was really about was the nature of truth and the importance of truth, and how there are so many more things in life that are important other than business. And so it was literally a speech about how easy it is to lie by taking things out of context. And what happened to him was a lie was told about him by taking that line out of context. There's a deep historical irony there that 100 years ago, Calvin Coolidge gave a speech about how easy it is to tell lies by removing something from context. And the only thing we remember about that speech is a lie that we tell because it was taken out of context. Yeah. So on one hand, I would like to say I would like to be relevant and listen and make the argument that Calvin Coolidge made, which is, it sort of comes down to this. don't you want your beliefs to be based on the truth? I mean, at a very basic level, what kind of a life do you want to lead as an individual? Do you want to have lies that you build your life upon that you then take to the grave? Or do you want to engage in a careful study in order to be engaged in a lifetime of constant improvement and the humility that comes with it? Because my next reaction, anytime we talk about the causes of something like what happened in January, I'm reminded of one of my other favorite phrases, which is, out of the crooked timber of humanity, nothing straight has ever been wrought. A single individual can't even begin to contemplate the motivations for everything that they do during the day. So trying to say why 10,000 people are doing a specific thing at a specific time, it involves a great deal of summary and humility. But the other piece of this is that this doesn't leave us, crippled and unable to make reasonable conclusions. And so what I would hope the role of the historian would be we should be the ones who are beginning with facts, putting these facts into their proper context, and doing it in a way that is maybe the opposite of how we've been taught to think over the past 40 or 50 years. Because over the past 40 or 50 years, we've been under the influence of the social sciences, which isn't necessarily a bad thing in all cases, but I think people often confuse what social science is supposed to do, which is measure what is happening in society. And people often lapse into the idea that somehow they're supposed to tell us what to do rather than to measure things. Mm-hmm. But they can only measure things based on our values. And when we're trying to think about the deepest, most important questions in all of human history, how human beings should live, what we should value, what we should want are tested and accredited means of thinking about these deep issues in context. And social science won't provide those answers ever. It can't. It's really only the study of the old humanities that will provide us with the values that we need to tell the social sciences what to study or what to measure.
So, Professor, just as how do I respond to this, this huge amorphous question I'm asking? I could take this in 100 different ways. So let's take it in this way for just a moment. Of something we've talked about now at least a half a dozen times or a dozen times, and that's the founding of our country and whether we're a racist country or not. If we were to do a poll, and I know you hate polls, so that's why I bring it up, but if we were to do a poll, I would think a majority of Americans, and I'm sure there's polls on this, all men are created equal. Well, that means white male landowners. I think a majority of answers to that of Americans would answer that doesn't mean all men, it doesn't mean women, it didn't mean blacks, it didn't mean indigenous population. And so my question to you in that context is, how are we supposed to determine history? You have told me to read books by real historians, so I have. And I have found that they're more complex than I first imagined. I mean, there isn't a 100% right answer on what Washington thought, or the colonies of Virginia, or what Lincoln, how he was going through the Civil War. It is really complex. And so I'm trying to form my answer now as a 55-year-old, which was different than an 18-year-old taking a civics class or two. How am I supposed to determine the truth? What is history? What's the process of a historian in understanding something as the founding of our country and slavery? How do we go about this better as society?
I'm reminded something that just popped into my head is the way you frame this question. I was thinking about one of the things that students often struggle with is when I tell them that they have to have a thesis. And the next thing you tell them is that a thesis is not a fact and it's not an opinion. And people will then say, well, wait a minute, that's all there is, right? There's facts and there's opinions and that's it. How can there be anything else? And the answer is that there's something that the human brain is capable of that is not a fact and it's not an opinion. It is drawing a reasonable conclusion from evidence and asserting it. And the assertion that you make that is a reasonable conclusion based on facts that are put into their proper context, that's what becomes your thesis statement. So we shouldn't find ourselves crippled and unable to answer these fundamental questions, because yes, it is entirely possible for us to find something out of context in order to prove anything. And that's, I guess maybe I'll hammer this point about why the social sciences are inadequate for answering these questions. It's because we, in social sciences, or often teachers will do this in an attempt to not be biased. They'll say, I want a pro and con about a specific question. And what you find is that once you start putting things into the ideological framework that you have, and then the assumption is that there's a pro and a con, you're going to go back and only see the evidence for the pros or the cons. And what you might miss is that you're asking the wrong question. That in fact, the story that is the accurate story to tell about the past will not serve to prove that the pro and con that you've come up with in the year 2021, that's an accurate story about the past. Because I can answer the question very easily about the Declaration of Independence. If you ask a question like, when he said all men are created equal, did he mean white men? And did he specifically mean to exclude slaves? That's an easy one. Somebody can Google this right now, find the original draft of the Declaration of Independence, where he refers to slaves as being men and human beings and slavery as an execrable common. Or you could look at the drafting of the Constitution, where it comes up in the debates, how should we deal with slavery? And then somebody thinks, well, should we mention slavery? And then somebody says, well, wait, we want to make sure and never use the word slavery, because we never want to imply that there could be property in man. And so instead, slaves are or not referred to specifically in the Constitution, but people who would be in the category of slaves are referred to in the constitutions as persons held to service or labor, implying that there are people, slaves included, who the states are holding to service and labor, and that the federal government doesn't therefore recognize that those people are actually property. So in some ways, those are the easy questions to answer, because there is such an obvious documentary evidentiary trail that's almost one-to-one.
So Professor, remember your big picture answer, but let me just punch back on one specific. And my guess is you'll be able to just squash it right down. But let me punch back on one specific. Yes, if we look at the original draft of Jefferson, of the Declaration of Independence, Jefferson thought that slaves were humans, not property. But the answer among the compromise of all the states is the states didn't agree to that. And your response back is, well, one state, but the answer is they didn't agree to it.
Well, if it had been a vote, they would have, but that's not what the Declaration was supposed to be. The Declaration was supposed to be the common sense of the subject, and it was supposed to only be the things that everyone agreed upon. So the fact that there were two delegates who said, I think slave owners might have a problem with this, meant that they just struck it, because it was the Declaration of Independence was only supposed to be the things that they all agreed upon. Now, what that means is that those two people thought, well, this is a little too harsh of a condemnation of slavery, but they didn't strike out the all men are created equal part, because they all believed that all men were created equal. But two representatives from two colonies thought that the condemnation of slavery itself was too harsh. So there was so understand it this way: 100% of Americans believed all men are created equal, and believed that Black people were human beings. And but the specific criticism of slavery that Jefferson made, representatives from 2 states objected to.
Okay, I don't want to dwell too much into that because I want you to go back to the big picture now. Keep going on if you remember your line of thought.
Well, no, that's my only response. But I would just say, like, in terms of what history can teach us, what it should teach us, hopefully, is diligence. And one of the things that's very difficult now is I often think about the status of somebody like my old advisor, Alonzo Hamby. This is a guy who, when I asked him a question once about Harry Truman being a county commissioner, he told me the story of how he took 2 weeks and he went and visited all the roads that Harry Truman had approved when he was a county commissioner. They didn't call it a commissioner where he was, and I just remember thinking that what Twitter does and what social media does is it makes someone who rolls out of bed one day, they can make a meme and they are allegedly the same status as an Alonzo Hamby. And that's an inappropriate way to go through life. To say that somebody who just has an opinion, who your gut or your feelings happens to agree with, that somehow that's of equal stature and should be weighed equally with somebody who has investigated the life of Harry Truman to such an extent that he spent 2 weeks studying something that no one else cares about. As I would often say, if I ever disagreed with Alonzo Hamby, I'm wrong. I just haven't figured out how yet. I'm not allowed to disagree with him. Really, I mean, because I don't know that there are very many subjects that I've studied more than him.
So Professor, let's take a practical real life experience on that then. Every day I see memes or some other kind of commentary on Facebook from both my leftist, my conservative, and my liberal friends. And oftentimes, not always, but oftentimes the quote or the suggestion is so patently wrong that it takes me all of like 13 seconds to Google and see that it's wrong. And then I have to ponder whether I want to critique a friend and say, do you really mean that? And occasionally I do. I say, hey, by the way, just want you to know that that's just wrong and you should know it. And they go, yeah, I know it's wrong, or maybe I don't know if it's wrong. I don't care. I'm madder than hell about left or right or whatever they're madder than hell about. How do we get out of this? How does you say read real books? The average American citizen doesn't want to read a 500-page treatise on the founding of the Virginia colonies. I did, but as you've told me, I'm kind of rare. How do we make common sense out of history when it's just apparently no one wants to do that today? It's not rewarded.
I would say that, we have to get to the point where we reject the basic premise. Hold on, let me answer this another way. Let me start with why I'm about to say is the answer. One thing to understand is that confirmation bias is the most powerful bias that a human being has. The second most powerful bias that a human being has is social bias. So those two feelings that we have as human beings, we want to be right about ourselves and we want other people to perceive us as being right. Those forces are so powerful within us that we would rather die than be wrong about ourselves or be perceived as being wrong by others.
Including you, by the way, Professor. Do you mean this is a universal human trait?
Yes, this is universal, a universal human trait. So, but because we are human beings, we can do things in order to minimize the effects of confirmation and social bias on ourselves. And the first is to always begin with the sources and surround yourself with people who engage in authentic dissent. So what that means is that, the way to fix this in society would to have our elite institutions, people like the professors and journalists,
People we hate, by the way, we don't respect them anymore. They're institutional.
but they're still responsible for shaping our culture. Anyone, and I would also say not just I mean, elite and people who head elite institutions, but also politicians and anybody who's in any position of leadership, and that would include in your own families, how you model behavior within your own family. What you try to do is begin your study of any subject with humility. And the reason why I always suggest reading books or reading primary source documents, reading good books, reading vetted, tested, and accredited books and primary sources is precisely because what you want is information put into context by someone who's an expert in putting good information into context. But at the same time, you want to try to, something magical happens when you read. When you read, you inhabit the mind of the author. It's one of the things, we've talked about James Weldon Johnson before, one of my favorite intellectuals from the 19th century. And he wrote one book of fiction, a book called The Autobiography of an Ex-Colored Man. And he later said why he was doing that is because he wanted to play with the idea of consciousness. He knew that if anybody read this book of fiction, that they would find themselves inhabiting the mind of a Black man and not be aware of it. And so what happens when you become invested in a book, if it's a good book, or an article, if it's someone who you're really taking seriously, is you will inhabit their mind. And these forces combined with, I guess we'll call this part 3, which is try not to ask yourself questions that will frame discussions in terms of confirmation bias. So, I think that if we just begin approaching information this way, that would go a long way towards getting society on a more healthy footing. Say we're gonna read the primary sources, we're gonna read scholarly secondary sources, and then we're going to try to get into the habit of not introducing confirmation bias into how we approach questions of public policy.
Okay, so that all presupposes an answer of intellectual curiosity, or doing what's right and just, or being a good human being, or maybe there's 5 or 6 other ways of saying it. Isn't the history of the human race not based on that at all? It's just based off power, and I mean, just like making sure that I'm okay, or my spouse is okay, and my immediate family's okay, and maybe whoever.
We audio cut out, but I think I know where your question was going. Were you going to say in human history, human history teaches us that human beings are capable of large acts of evil. How do we counter that? Is that the question? Maybe we should wait for his audio to catch up. I'll answer what you already said.
Thank you.
Yes, all the great evils in human history were all committed by people who thought that what they were doing was right. Most people aren't sociopaths, and in order to engage in wide-scale, large acts of evil, you have to first believe that what you're doing is right. But our country is an experiment, and that's in Federalist 1, that the existence of the United States is here really to decide the important question in all of human history. And the important question in all of human history is not, are men angels, but can human beings govern themselves? Can we set up a system that requires us to use reflection and choice rather than accident and force. Because you're absolutely right. Without a commitment to a set of ideals, without a commitment to the set of ideals as they were outlined by our founders, you're absolutely right. Human beings will lapse back into living by accident and force, because that's what we did for tens of thousands of years. That we will immediately go back to whoever is the most violent, exercising as much violence as they can possibly get away with. And because that's our default position. But what human beings are also, but that's part of the human condition. We can't deny that that's part of what our brain wants to do. But there's another part of our brain that is capable of reflection and choice. And what we need to cherish is and savor and recognize that as the source of our security and our own safety is a commitment to the system that forces us into reflection and choice, and always settling for what is better rather than insisting upon an ideal solution. Something that Theodore Roosevelt said, I care about the man who takes the next step, not the one who theorizes about the 100th step. And I've always loved that line of Theodore Roosevelt. What's the next step that we can take together? And I'll partner with anyone to take that next step. And let's worry about our theoretical disagreements some other day. This is going to be the room we're full of people who take the next step.
Love it. So, Professor, I'm going to do something unique. I'm going to end early instead of asking another series of questions about abortion and the Second Amendment to provide context. That was so remarkable that I think we should just pause at that and see if there's other questions. You only have 15 minutes before you need to head off to another engagement.
Well, actually, I'm good.
You are good now.
I'm good till almost 12. Yeah.
Oh, good. Well, then we have lots of time. I bet I'll squeeze in abortion and Second Amendment after we see if other folks have questions. So I do want to open it up to the folks that have been kind enough to join us to see if you understand why I'm asking these questions and how important Professor Tootle's answers are. So don't ask the first question of me. What are you doing, John? Let's ask questions of Professor Tootle, though, on how we might be better citizens in America. So before you ask, Professor Tootle's father, do you want to take yourself off mute and ask him a question? Or if you don't, we'll no pressure. We'll give you 3 seconds. It's just an honor for you to be here. I'm glad you're here. Okay, you can take another bite at the apple if you wish, Mr. Tootle. Bart, you're up.
Hold on, got to unmute. The thing that strikes me about our conversation today is kind of the emphasis on figuring out what really are the facts. And I agree with what John was saying, and this isn't a question for John, so I'm not violating the rule you just put out there, John. It seems that most people in modern society don't want to spend a lot of time figuring out what the truth actually is about anything. And I do appreciate, I've tried to do more of what you have advised over the last 6 or 7 months. My first reaction to something is not going to be emotional outrage. It's going to be, well, is that really true? Let me read something else and figure it out. Is there a way to, to dumb that down for society right now, or not?
Well, I thought about this. I do a podcast with the editor of a newspaper, and who is better situated to engage in this kind of activity than someone who's literally the editor of a newspaper? And credibility is one of those things that's very difficult to get back. And how Americans feel about the media and journalists, I would say journalists earned that contempt, many of them. You know, when I open up the New York Times, I am often horrified with the first take that the New York Times, the newspaper of record, will have on a series of events. And I think the New York Times is a good example of a place that has been captured by, or that is that has no authentic dissent within its ranks. And if you have followed the saga of several of the journalists who have left the New York Times over the last few years, I think that what I'm saying has been borne out. But there's no substitute for leadership's being for leadership. There's no substitute for leaders being leaders. There's no substitute for people who are supposed to put things into context, not putting things in context. You know, I would say my profession is maybe the worst. I mean, I act like history is, you know, some pristine thing, but that's really something that exists between me, the circle of friends, and the historians who I admire. While this is going on, the rest of my discipline has gone completely crazy. I could read you the program for the last 3 American Historical Association meetings, and what you would see is, would probably be horrifying to a normal person, what's going on in my own discipline. So every single person who's listening should be pointing at me saying, you know, physician, heal thyself. It's happening in my discipline as well. I don't know of anything that can be done other than to do what we're doing. If I did, I would be doing it. But at the same time, there are people who are specifically responsible for this. And it's not that hard to identify the elite institutions. It's not that hard to identify when it takes place. It's not that hard to identify what the problems are in these cultures. But there is no will to fix the problem because the incentive structures are all built in such a way that if you are the one journalist who manages to get hired at the New York Times as a journalist, I'm not talking about somebody, I know they just hired John McWhorter, who's one of the most brilliant men in America right now. And I will read everything that John McWhorter writes for the New York Times, but he's not a reporter. But if they were to hire someone like a John McWhorter as a journalist, covering tax policy at the House of Representatives or something, that person would be fired. They would be drummed out of office. They would not be able to survive. And so you really have to have elite institutions go out of their way to fix this problem. And the only people who can do that are leaders. That's it. There is no royal road. Leaders have to insist that these institutions change. And there is no substitute for that. Now, as the American public, I would say that what you should be doing is putting pressure on boards of trustees, because boards of trustees are still the governing agencies for many of these elite institutions. And if you would like to see these things change, I would say, how about this? It's funny, it's sitting right here on my desk. This book, The Coddling of the American Mind. I've now purchased this for 6 different people. And this one is not my copy. This is the next copy that I bought to give away to someone in a position of leadership. But I've often thought that what I should do is I should buy, 6 copies of it and give it to the board of trustees at my college and just say, listen, I don't know if you're going to read this or pay attention to it, but you're the leader. At least it's off my conscience that I've told you what the problem is. But, as I haven't done that myself, I don't know if it would be hypocritical to say that this is something other people should do. But I think that anyone who is on any board of trustees of any institution, doesn't have to be higher education, should read The Coddling of the American Mind and make sure that they aren't doing something out of good intentions that's actually harming people.
So, Professor, let me do a nuance of Bart's question as a follow-up. Isn't it true that you're probably, this is a subtle jab at you, so you'll probably be able to swat it away okay. Isn't it true that your physician heal thyself on your number 2 is probably pretty strong? The reason I like you is because you're a conservative, but you also seem rational. And the reason I like you is you're not angry. You're thoughtful. You have tremendous concerns about the Republican Party and the former president, but you're not just like a ranting lunatic about it. And so you have a confirmation bias towards folks like David French and Goldberg and folks that I like. I like you because we have a similar philosophy. Isn't that, I mean, do you truly have crazy communist and socialist friends that are advocating against your thoughts of limited government and less taxation and personal responsibility? I mean,
yes.
Where are you?
No, I don't have any, well, I'm trying to think. Probably the person who is a friend of mine who is politically the closest to me would be my friend Tom Brasino, the military historian who we brought in.
But he's conservative, Professor.
I understand, but I'm trying to, what I mean by that is that everyone else in my life tells me that I'm wrong all the time. Okay. Every other historian who I read, every other intellectual I engage with, I don't have anybody, nobody agrees with me. I mean, there are these little islands of again, my confirmation bias, these islands of what I would consider sanity, the Dispatch, the Ashbrook Center in Ohio. But, even my islands of sanity have gotten smaller and smaller and smaller over the years. So I am well aware that when I speak, no one agrees with me. But at the same time, 80% of Americans agree with me. The elite institutions that I exist in and engage in ideas with, they're such a tiny fraction of American society. But I think how I get some feedback is when I speak to, especially pre-COVID, I haven't done any of this or much of it lately, but once I speak to groups in public, you start to realize that 9 out of 10 people are cheering you on, and there are one or two people who are angry with you. And that's probably a better indicator of where the American people are.
Why does all the money go to the 1 or 2 then rather than the majority? That doesn't make sense to me.
Why does all the money go to them? Yeah,
the advertising dollars, the political organizations, the fundraising apparatus, the political dynamics, we're all going to the extreme. What you just said makes sense to me, but it's not living out in reality. We just go ahead.
Oh, it's simple, and it's a fundraising principle, because that's how you raise money. The thing that motivates people to give money is when they are angry and excited about a about the perceived radicalism of an enemy who presents an imminent threat to you. And I mean, I guess I'd just say part of the answer to your question is we're just so much better at fundraising now. I mean, marketing is much more efficient than it used to be. So, and if you know that there's hard money and there's easy money, the easy money is getting a bunch of people angry and all hated up. And that's the easiest money in the world to raise. It's almost impossible to raise money from normal people who aren't full of hate, because being full of hate is when you give money.
Yeah, so we got to fix that. Okay, I accept your answer for now. Dr. Force, I always want to honor you because you're a longtime caller, and plus you have a doctor, and everybody loves PhDs.
Yeah, right.
Dr. Force, do you have a question?
No, I'm just sitting here thinking that how much I come in with my bias to the classroom, and how much I, as a person or as an educator, approach everybody in a singular manner so that I can see how they learn the best. You know, I don't know where I end up in this conversation, but it's very interesting because I see both sides of the equation of people coming to me. And I always go to the point where, okay, if you're mad about this, fine. If you're not, fine. But what is the common ground, and what is the history, and what is the actuality of this point of view? Because when people come to me for help in the classroom, it's more or less like, sorry, I'm searching for words. It's more like, you know, they feel so dismissed to their point of view, and they need validation of somehow, and it's to take their point of view and set it aside and say, okay, so how do you learn that point of view? Does that make sense?
Sure. And I mean, since my father is listening in right now, something you said reminded me of just, in many ways, I was just lucky to have the dad I had. You know, one of the things that my father is particularly skilled at and was consistent at for my entire life was he was an analyst, and he always just he never wanted my life to be built upon lies. And so his way of saying it is he would often say, if it could be a math equation, he would just say, run the numbers. It'll tell you what to do. But if it was something in my personal life or a decision that I had to make, he always started by making me confront reality on reality's terms. In other words, son, you don't create reality. You are not the creator of reality. So you need to accept reality first and then proceed. And that mindset, I mean, I was just instilled in me by my father.
That wasn't instilled in me by my father and my uncles, all of my family, all the men in my family. It's very interesting to sit and think, you know, you come from an academic institution. Which one is it again?
My PhD is from Ohio University.
And I was at Regis University for 30 years. And it is just, you know, I heard those people with very liberal ideas. I heard the people with very conservative ideas. And I didn't care about either or. I cared about, how are you perceiving it, and how does this help you learn what you need to learn to survive in society. And so that's where my thought process is when I hear you guys talk.
Well, one of the things that happened yesterday when I was in the classroom, I was talking about the Bill of Rights yesterday and the Second Amendment. And I sort of say what you're going to learn today is not going to confirm your bias if you're anti-gun or if you're pro-gun, because what I teach stays the same year after year. It doesn't change based on whatever the contemporary position on guns happens to be. Here are Madison's notes. Here's what it said. Here are the militia laws. This is what, and once you begin studying it, you realize that it doesn't really support any contemporary sides or any contemporary political question. It can inform how you approach these questions, but it's not going to give you a perfect answer. You're going to find that reality is unsatisfying unless you approach history. Now, this is where I insult John. Unless you approach history like you're a lawyer. But I'm not a lawyer. I'm not an advocate. I'm not here to say, I know my perspective, now let me find the facts that demonstrate my perspective. I am here to say, here are the facts, here's what they say. And the wonderful thing about teaching that way year after year is that you find, at least for me, the reason why teaching's so fun, I've been teaching now for 23 or 24 years, and the reason I'm still engaged every year is because the documents stay the same. Madison's notes on the Constitution stay the same. I change every year. And what it means to me, it changes every year because I'm a different person when I come back to those sources. So it's not my job to, I won't go so far. I do think that, it is my job to teach things to my students. So I'm always cautious when people say, oh, you're not supposed to indoctrinate your students. Well, I'm supposed to indoctrinate my students with some things. But the main thing I'm trying to get them to have are the habits of a scholar so that they will keep returning to the sources and let the sources be their guide first. There's a maxim, Lord Chesterton, that said, and I'm paraphrasing Chesterton's maxim, but it's something like, you don't get to change a rule until you can tell me why it was there in the first place. I'm sure Jake's going to Google this and get the accurate quote before, or Jason will, but it's something along those lines. But first, you have to understand what, until we're not going to tear down this fence until we know why it was built in the first place. And then if you can tell me why it was built in the first place, then we know whether or not we should tear it down. But step one is find out why it was built in the first place.
Okay,
Yeah,
Professor, I've got a series of questions to follow up, but we only have 11 minutes. So let me see if other folks have a quick question and a response. Andrea, you're a first-time caller to our show. No pressure, but want to give you the honor of asking a question if you have one. I think you're trying to take yourself off mute. You took yourself off video, which is nice. Okay, Andrea, we'll go back to you if you can figure it out. Jake or Jason, you're up.
Yeah, I guess
Jake.
I'll go. So Tootle, you had mentioned something about talking, working with leaders to make sure that we help get the system changed. That's right?
Mm-hmm. Yes.
Okay. So a book that you promote a lot is Stephen Knott's book, The Lost Soul of the American Presidency. And
Yeah.
I've taken a class from Knott and talked with him about this. His whole thesis in the book is the way that we can help restore the American government system to the way that Hamilton and Washington designed it and set it up, was that the president needs to willingly give up his political power that he has accumulated and go back to the way the Constitution is set up, where Congress is in charge because they're Article 1, and then the executive branch goes to kind of following the lead of Congress because, the president is Article 2. Does that seem realistic to you? Because from my perspective and the way that the media swings stuff, I don't see the president giving back power, because it looks to me that Congress doesn't really want to do its job. They just want to look good on the news so that they can fundraise money.
So what's the facts? What are the opinions? And what's your rant, Professor?
Yes, first of all, I'd say that Stephen Knott is another one of those people who I say if I ever disagree with him, he's right and I'm wrong. You don't get any smarter, kinder, or wiser than Stephen Knott. He is, to my mind, maybe one of the most valuable people in America today. So we should all pay attention to everything he says. He's right. I would add on to that, though, that Congress also has a duty that they should take back their rightful place in our system. That they should be the primary vehicle of, at least in terms of domestic policy. It is where the will of the American people is supposed to go. And they should stop delegating power and authority to the executive branch. Now the next, so everybody has a role to play. The president has a role to play, Congress has a role to play, and the American people have a role to play as well, which is we need to start insisting on our elected representatives acting this way. And in many ways, just voting for the best, just vote for the most sane person would be probably the best advice I could give you. And we're still pretty good at that. One of the things that you should find shocking, I always say to my Democratic friends, is that the American people are pretty good at voting for whoever is the most sane candidate. And you need to recognize just how insane many of your candidates are too. Because don't just look at who Donald Trump beat. Look at who Trump supporters are beating on your side and realize that you aren't putting up good candidates either. And that's how crazy you are. But again, you don't see your own crazy. You only see the crazy of the other side. And I think one of the flaws that are present in both parties, but also politicians who exist outside the party system now, is that you have to give the American people some place to go. They have to have a normal person outlet. They have to have at least one normal person to vote for, or else they'll simply say, like, I don't know, which kind of crazy seems less crazy.
All right, Jake, I now know who I'm going to support if I ever move to Utah. So thank you for your question. Andrea, I think you tried to take yourself off mute and then put yourself back on. Do you have a question? Hold on.
Can you take yourself off mute? Maybe not.
Well, she's tried, and I'd like to honor her, but we only have 5 minutes left.
No, she's waving us off.
Okay, all right. We'll get you next time, Andrea. Thank you for calling in. Jason, you prefer typing again, or do you have a question live? Okay, while you're thinking about that, Professor, I do want you a quick answer on two of our most controversial questions. Jake, or Jason, do you have a question? No. Professor, the two of the most controversial issues of the day, abortion. Why can't we agree whether there's a fundamental right to privacy under the Constitution guaranteed by the 14th Amendment, which led to Roe v. Wade? Right now, we fight about this constantly. We hate each other as Americans over abortion. Isn't that all a fact, what I just said? Or no, there's so many nuances, John, that it's essential that we continue to fight this fight.
I would even go maybe even further and say that you don't even need the 14th Amendment to have a fundamental right of privacy. It's one of the problems of the Bill of Rights that the Federalists point out. If you start enumerating these powers, then you're going to think that the only rights you have are the ones that are listed. But that's why we had the 9th and 10th Amendments that say specifically, hey, this is not a list of all your rights. And absolutely in every single case, our founders would have considered a right to privacy to be absolutely a fundamental human right. But before we take that horse and ride it off into the sunset, realize that under a political system, no right is supreme, and all rights are to be balanced against all other rights. So you don't get to simply say, I've now won the argument, there is a right to privacy in the Constitution. It is, how do we manage this right along with other rights? And how do you manage this right as, you know, and this is one of those cases where medical advances in some ways change the fundamental question, because what is a viable human life has changed over the last 30, 40 years. So, you know, just that alone. What about the rights of the father? It's not enough to simply say that the father has no rights. What about the rights of the mother? What about the rights of the physician? What about, I mean, there are simply all of these things that are need to be taken into account. But the other thing that's nice about our system is we don't have to solve all of these problems today for the whole country. There are certainly things that you could do.
Back to federalism, you mean? Is it the federalism?
Yeah, I mean, the first answer is simply this. This is, to me, a much clearer case of something that is best handled under the states than under the federal Constitution. And we give states this fundamental right to manage issues of life and death every day. Some states have the death penalty, other states don't. We already give to the states vast powers over who goes to jail, under what circumstances, who lives and who dies. So the idea that somehow abortion is an issue that the states are incapable of dealing with is simply not true. We deal with hot button issues at the state level all the time. Where, you know, it's the tricky issues come up and will find their way to the Supreme Court have to do with, are the states interfering with a constitutionally protected right under the Constitution? So that isn't to say that the federal government has no role to play in all of this, but the system that we set up and the system that we have a long legal tradition of implementing says that we give wide latitude to states, but if you go too far in one direction, the federal government's going to come in and say, you've gone too far. And that's not going to be a satisfying answer for anyone who has strong feelings about the issue of abortion. The other thing I would remind people of is that freedom doesn't, remember what Dick Cheney said about gay rights. Freedom means freedom for everyone. And just because something is allowed by the law doesn't make it right. And it doesn't remove your ability as a human being to make moral judgments or to live your life a certain way. There is a benefit to having some of these issues simply not legislated at all, so that our cultural institutions have a chance to solve what might actually be a cultural problem. It might be something that's so fundamental and intimate that it and personal that we simply need to say that this is not what your city council is for. This is not what your county commissioners are for. This is not what your state legislatures are for. This is something, I mean, let's go back to what Lincoln told us, the proper role of government. The proper role of government is to do for a community of citizens what they cannot do or do so well for themselves in their separate but individual capacities. And in all other things, government ought not to interfere. And maybe this is one of those issues where we simply say, well, I personally don't like abortions under any circumstances. Therefore, in my personal life, that's how I'm going to live my life. This person wants abortions on demand. And neither one of us gets to insist that other people enforce our beliefs. You know, maybe I don't get to tell somebody else how to live their life, but maybe you don't get to tell this other guy how to live his life either. And if we would return to the idea that maybe this is something that, and it's a simple enough thing to do, you would simply say, the government will have no role in this. We're not going to pay for it. We're not going to tax for it. We're not going to punish it. We're not going to subsidize it. In a sense, we're going to regulate health procedures if you do anything that we call unhealthy. But it's, in other words, there are many issues that need to be handled by individual human beings. And maybe this happens to be one of these issues that needs to be devolved back to the individual with the understanding that when the issue is devolved back to the individual, that doesn't mean that you personally approve of this thing. You can support the legalization of marijuana without believing that you should smoke marijuana. I support the legalization of marijuana. I don't think anybody should smoke marijuana, but I have a lot of friends who do, and it's not a huge deal to me. But if you were to ask me, is it better if, well, I don't know, if you're using it as medicine, maybe, but I just mean, like, who cares? And whether I'm for it or against it has nothing to do with, I don't think the law needs to always be an expression of my own personal prejudices.
Okay, Professor, it's 3 afternoon and you've got to get going to your other meeting now. You've overextended. But I do think that was a good summation on the history of current cultural dialogue and whether it's facts, opinion, or rants. I will take your last statement as an opinion, not a rant. I'm not sure it's a fact. Professor, really appreciate this. You just do awesome in these shows. Folks, we're not going to do a private discussion after this because he's got to get moving, but I will briefly say that Bart Miller, Juris Doctorate, Esquire, is going to be our first non-historian co-interviewer next Friday. We're going to talk about how laws are made, but with an angle of the history of how laws are made, with somebody who wrote the laws for 30 or 40 years, plus Professor Tootle's perspective on that. So I hope you join us next Friday. There's a 10% chance it may need to get moved for a week because I may be traveling, but hopefully next Friday at 11 o'clock Mountain. Professor, thank you for your time. Most important is Mr. Keith Tootle. What an honor to have you here as a guest to hear from Professor Stephen Tootle. Everyone, thank you. Have a great day.